Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow Lewis and Clark past the maps into the cold, exhausted nights they never wrote home about, where doubt, desertion, and quiet desperation slept beside them under the western sky. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if they are not already closed. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you right now, the weight of your limbs becoming heavier, the tension in your shoulders beginning to soften, your breath moving slowly in and out like the surface of a wide, quiet river. Somewhere in the dark of early America, before highways and electric lights and the long-reaching hum of cities, there were two men standing at the edge of everything they had ever known. Behind them, a continent they could name. Ahead of them, a silence so vast and so old that it had no language yet. Tonight, we are going to follow them into that silence. There is no urgency here. No destination to reach before morning. We are simply going to walk alongside them, through the tall grass and the river fog, past the firelight and into the deep quiet of the American wilderness, and we are going to let their story carry us gently into sleep. Breathe in. Let the image of a wide, dark river form somewhere behind your closed eyes. Part 1: The river before it had a name. There is a particular kind of darkness that only exists far from human settlements. Not the darkness of a closed room, or a city street at 3 a.m. with its amber halos and its distant traffic. This is a different thing entirely. It is the darkness of a continent breathing slowly under a sky so thick with stars that the light itself becomes a kind of texture, something you feel rather than simply see, a soft pressure at the edge of everything. Meriwether Lewis had seen that darkness before, in small doses, on the edges of the Virginia countryside where he grew up. He knew what the forest smelled like at night, the damp earthiness of leaves turning slowly back into soil, the faint sweetness of something blooming just beyond the reach of the lantern. He had walked out into it as a boy, alone, long after his household was asleep, drawn by some quiet restlessness that he could never quite name. That restlessness would eventually carry him to the far edge of the known world. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us begin where all great journeys begin, not with the departure, but with the circumstances that made departure feel necessary. The year was 1803. The United States of America was, by any historical measure, a very young country, barely 2 decades removed from the moment it had declared itself into existence. It occupied, officially, the eastern third of the North American continent, a long, narrow band of territory stretching from the Atlantic coastline westward to the Mississippi River. West of that great river, the maps became uncertain. West of that great river, there were drawings of rivers that no American surveyor had walked beside, mountains that existed only in rumor, and enormous blank spaces that cartographers sometimes filled with speculative flourishes or simply left empty. Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States, had been thinking about those blank spaces for most of his adult life. Jefferson was a man of extraordinary intellectual appetite, a philosopher, an architect, a naturalist, a politician, a slaveholder, a dreamer. He had spent years collecting reports from fur traders and explorers who had pushed westward into the continent's interior, piecing together fragments of information the way a scholar assembles a broken manuscript, carefully, with great patience, knowing that the complete picture might never emerge but that the attempt itself was worthwhile. He believed, or rather, he hoped, that somewhere in the Western Territory there existed a practical water route from the Missouri River all the way to the Pacific Ocean. A northwest passage, not through the frozen north as earlier explorers had sought, but through the temperate heart of the continent. Such a route would transform trade, extend American influence, and open the western lands to settlement and commerce. In the spring of 1803, something happened that changed the urgency of that hope into something more pressing. Napoleon Bonaparte, facing a collapsing empire in the Caribbean and the looming threat of renewed war with Britain, decided that the vast French territory of Louisiana, which stretched from New Orleans northward to the Canadian border and westward across the plains, was more liability than asset. He offered to sell it to the United States. Jefferson, despite some constitutional hand-wringing, agreed. The Louisiana Purchase, concluded in the summer of 1803, nearly doubled the size of the United States overnight. For the price of approximately $15 million, the young nation had acquired roughly 828,000 square miles of land that almost no American citizen had ever seen. And now someone had to go look at it. Jefferson had already been planning exactly that. Months before the purchase was formalized, he had written to his personal secretary, a young Virginian Army captain named Meriwether Lewis, with a proposition. Jefferson had watched Lewis grow from a boy on the neighboring Locust Hill plantation into a serious, capable, somewhat melancholy young man who possessed an unusual combination of scientific curiosity and physical endurance. He was precisely the kind of person Jefferson needed. Someone who could survive the wilderness and also write coherently about it afterward. The letter Jefferson sent to Lewis in the winter of 1803 was careful and precise. It laid out, in the patient language of a scholar who had been thinking about this for a long time, exactly what a Western expedition should accomplish. Lewis was to explore the Missouri River and its tributaries. He was to find the most direct and practicable water route to the Pacific. He was to observe the soil, the climate, the mineral resources, the flora, and the fauna. He was to make careful note of the Indian nations he encountered, their languages, their customs, their population, their trade goods, and he was to treat them with respect and diplomacy. It was, in its quiet way, one of the most ambitious sets of instructions ever given to a single human being. Lewis received the letter, read it carefully, and then did something interesting. He did not immediately begin preparing his own equipment. Instead, he wrote to his old friend William Clark. William Clark was 33 years old in 1803, 4 years older than Lewis. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, red-haired, with the practical, patient temperament of someone who had spent years managing difficult situations in difficult terrain. He had served under General Anthony Wayne in the frontier campaigns of the 1790s. He had supervised river transport, managed supply lines, kept the peace between competing factions of difficult men. Where Lewis was intense and introverted, prone to long silences and private brooding, Clark was sociable and pragmatic, quick to laugh, skilled at the thousand small negotiations of daily communal life. They had served together briefly in the army and had taken an immediate liking to each other, the way certain people do when they recognize something complementary in the other person's nature, not a mirror of themselves, but a balance. Lewis's letter to Clark was direct and warm. He described the expedition Jefferson had proposed. He said he could not imagine undertaking it without Clark by his side. He offered him a co-commander's role, equal in authority and equal in the letter's credit, even though the army bureaucracy would eventually demote Clark's official rank in a way that both men quietly resented for the rest of the journey. Clark's reply came back quickly, and it said yes. And so the preparations began. Lewis spent the spring and summer of 1803 in a kind of focused, restless education. He traveled to Philadelphia, which was then the center of American scientific and intellectual life, and submitted himself to a crash course in the practical sciences he would need on the frontier. He studied celestial navigation, how to determine latitude by measuring the angle of the sun, how to use the night sky as a map. He studied botany, learning the classification systems that would allow him to describe and preserve plant specimens in a way that scientists back east could use. He studied medicine, filling notebook after notebook with remedies and procedures for the injuries and illnesses a wilderness expedition might encounter. He also went shopping, in an almost heroic way. The list of supplies he assembled for the expedition fills several pages of the historical record, and reading it slowly is like reading a poem about preparedness or perhaps about the enormous, quiet uncertainty of what lay ahead. He ordered 193 pounds of portable soup, a dense, nutritious concentrate that could be dissolved in water when fresh game was unavailable. He ordered scientific instruments, sextants, a chronometer, thermometers, compasses. He ordered medicines, Peruvian bark for fever, mercury compounds for infection, lancets for bleeding. He ordered gifts for the Indian nations they would encounter, peace medals stamped with Jefferson's likeness, tobacco, mirrors, beads, bright ribbons, small American flags. All of this assembling, purchasing, packing, and planning took place against the backdrop of a life that was, on the surface, perfectly ordinary. Lewis ate meals. He wrote letters. He slept in beds. He walked through cities where people haggled over prices and complained about the weather. And somewhere underneath all of that ordinary surface, the expedition was gathering itself like a river builds before a flood, quietly, invisibly, with a patience that is only recognizable in retrospect. By the autumn of 1803, Lewis had made his way down the Ohio River, meeting Clark in Indiana Territory and beginning to recruit the men who would form what they called the Corps of Discovery. That name deserves a moment of attention. Corps of Discovery. Not Corps of Conquest. Not Corps of Settlement. Not even Corps of Exploration, which would have been the more straightforward label. Discovery. As if the land itself were a new thought, waiting to be had. As if the rivers and the mountains and the plains were ideas that would only fully exist once an American had looked at them and written them down. The native peoples who already lived on every inch of that land would have had a different word for what was coming. But that is a story for later in the night, when we have traveled further from the beginning and are sitting somewhere in the deep prairie dark, watching the fire burn low. For now, let the river carry us forward. Let the keelboat creak and settle in the current. Let the first stars of evening appear above the Missouri Valley, one by one. Part 2: The Men Who Would Walk into History. There is something worth pausing over, in the quiet way this kind of story invites, about who exactly those men were. Not the officers, we know Lewis and Clark well enough, or we think we do. But the other men. The ones whose names appear in the journals as entries, as observations, as moments. Private Silas Goodrich, who had a gift for fishing and would pull trout from rivers that no American had fished before. Sergeant Nathaniel Pryor, steady and dependable, a man who seemed to carry some deep internal quiet with him wherever he went. Private John Coulter, who would later walk back into the wilderness alone and become a legend in his own right. There were approximately 33 permanent members of the Corps of Discovery by the time the expedition departed in earnest, plus a shifting company of temporary personnel and supporting soldiers who accompanied them during the first leg of the journey. They came from different places in different circumstances, as men assembled for difficult ventures always do. Some had enlisted in the regular army and were simply assigned to the expedition. Others were recruited specifically, chosen for particular skills: hunting, blacksmithing, river navigation, carpentry. A few had frontier experience and knew, at least in part, what they were getting into. Others were younger men for whom the expedition represented their first real departure from the world they had always known. The process of recruitment and selection was careful and sometimes difficult. Lewis and Clark held informal auditions, essentially watching men shoot, watching them handle boats, watching how they responded when things went wrong in small ways, trying to assess who would stay steady when things went wrong in large ways, which they inevitably would. They winnowed the group over the winter of 1803 and 1804, encamped at a place they called Camp Du Bois, just north of the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, near the town of Wood River in present-day Illinois. It was a cold, muddy winter. The men built rough cabins and drilled and practiced and argued and occasionally got into the kind of trouble that young men without enough to do in cold, muddy places tend to get into: too much whiskey at the local settlements, disputes over discipline, a handful of incidents that required official attention. Lewis was often away during those months, traveling to St. Louis to gather intelligence, meet with local officials and traders, and absorb every piece of geographical information he could find about the upper Missouri. The management of the camp fell largely to Clark, who handled it with the patient authority of a man who understood that discipline, to be effective, had to be earned rather than simply commanded. There is a moment in Clark's journal from that winter that catches at something real. He wrote about watching the men in the early morning, going about their routines, splitting wood, checking equipment, talking quietly among themselves in the cold air. He noted their different qualities, which men seemed reliable, which needed watching, which had that particular quality of alertness that made a good frontiersman, capable of noticing the small changes in the environment that could mean safety or danger. He was building a team in his mind, weighing each person carefully, trying to imagine, with the limited information available to him, how each of them would behave when the landscape became truly foreign and the distances truly enormous. There was one member of the expedition who occupied a position unlike any other, and whose presence in the historical record raises questions that are still not fully answered. His name was York. York was William Clark's enslaved manservant, a large, powerfully built black man who had grown up alongside Clark in Virginia and who traveled with the expedition from beginning to end, crossing the continent and returning, enduring every hardship that every other member of the Corps endured, and perhaps more. York appears in the journals of the expedition with a kind of fragmentary regularity, present, clearly significant, but never fully centered in the narrative that Lewis and Clark were writing, because they were writing it from within a world that did not know how to center him. He appears when the native peoples they encountered reacted to him with astonishment and fascination. Some had never seen a black man before, and many believed he possessed special powers, rubbing at his skin as if trying to remove what they took for paint, marveling at his size and his strength. York participated in hunts. He participated in the diplomatic encounters with native nations. He voted, yes, voted in the expedition's democratic decisions about where to make camp and where to spend the winter, making him one of the first black men in American history to participate in any kind of collective democratic decision-making, a fact both extraordinary and heartbreaking when placed against the reality of his legal status. At the end of the expedition, when the other men received land grants and double pay as reward for their service, York received nothing. He remained enslaved. He asked Clark for his freedom, or at minimum for the chance to live near his wife in Louisville. Clark, whose journals suggest he genuinely cared for York in the complicated, diminished way that the slaveholding class sometimes cared for the people it owned, refused for years. There are letters in the historical record where Clark describes York's requests as impudent, as evidence of a personality that had been spoiled by the expedition, by the experience of being treated briefly, conditionally, by people who didn't know the rules, as a man among men. York was eventually given his freedom at some point around 1811, the exact date uncertain. What happened to him afterward is unclear. One account, from Clark himself, claimed York had set up a freight business in Tennessee and had died of cholera before 1832. Another account, from the fur trader Zenas Leonard, claimed to have encountered a black man living among the Crow Nation in the Rocky Mountains who described himself as having crossed the continent with white men years before. Whether those accounts describe the same man, or whether either is accurate, history does not say with certainty. York walked into the wilderness and walked back out, and the country he returned to had no way of keeping him properly in its story. We keep him in ours. Among the permanent members of the Corps was a man named George Drouillard, or Drouillard, as the journals often render his name, the phonetic approximation of a French pronunciation that Lewis and Clark never quite got right. Drouillard was the son of a French-Canadian father and a Shawnee mother, a skilled hunter and interpreter, fluent in the sign language that served as a trade language across the plains. He was arguably the most essential person on the expedition besides the two captains themselves, the man who filled the larder, who communicated when words failed, who moved through the wilderness with the quiet efficiency of someone who had grown up between two worlds and was at ease in both. There was also Patrick Gass, a carpenter from Pennsylvania who was eventually promoted to sergeant after the death of Sergeant Charles Floyd, the only member of the expedition who would die during the journey, likely of a ruptured appendix, a death that would have occurred regardless of where he was. Gass was practical and good-humored, and he would later publish his own account of the expedition in 1807, becoming the first member of the Corps to put his story in print. And there was Private Pierre Cruzat, a one-eyed French Creole boatman who played the fiddle with extraordinary energy and feeling. Cruzat's fiddle was not a luxury item or an afterthought. It was, in a very real sense, one of the expedition's most important diplomatic tools, music that could bridge the silence between people who shared no language, that could signal friendliness and ease in the tense moments of first contact, that could lift the spirits of cold, tired, hungry men who had been paddling against a strong current for weeks and needed something to remind them why they were alive. The sound of Cruzat's fiddle drifting across the water on a summer evening, or rising out of a winter camp in the high plains while snow fell softly through the firelight, that sound echoes through the journals of the expedition with a warmth that centuries cannot quite diminish. These were the people. Imperfect, capable, complicated, afraid sometimes, and sometimes brave in ways that surprised even themselves. On the 14th of May, 1804, they pushed off from their winter camp and headed up the Missouri River. The journey had begun. Part 3: The River in Full. The Missouri River in the spring of 1804 was not the river we know today. This was the rhythm of the river day, exhausting, relentless, measured not in miles but in the slow accumulation of effort. In good conditions, they might make 15 or 20 miles upstream. In bad conditions, fighting strong current, navigating snags, pushing through shallow sections, they might make 5 or 6. The landscape they moved through in those first weeks was the broad, fertile floodplain of the lower Missouri, dense forest along the banks, the trees heavy with new leaves in the spring warmth, the undergrowth thick with wild plums and gooseberries. They could hear birds constantly, the wild, liquid calls of species that had never been formally described, that Lewis would carefully shoot, examine, and write about with the focused attention of someone who understood that he was the first scientist to encounter them. Those walks along the bank were where Lewis did some of his finest scientific work. He collected plants, pressing them carefully between sheets of blotting paper that he carried specifically for that purpose, and described them in his journal with a combination of precise botanical language and something more personal, something that sounds almost like joy. Reading Lewis's plant descriptions, you can feel the pleasure he took in looking closely at things. He wrote about the petals of a new species of prairie flower with the same careful attention he gave to the stars or to the behavior of unfamiliar animals, as if the world were a manuscript that had been waiting for someone to read it properly. The temperature in those first weeks swung dramatically. Cool mornings that felt like late winter, full of mist rising off the river and the smell of wet earth. Afternoons that could be genuinely hot, the sun pressing down on the open water, the men's backs sweating through their linen shirts. Evenings that came slowly, the sky going through long passages of amber and rose before settling into darkness. They camped on the banks, usually on sandbars or elevated ground that offered some protection from the damp. The tents were canvas, not particularly warm, but sufficient for the weather they had so far encountered. The cooking was done over open fires using whatever combination of portable supplies and fresh-caught game the day's hunting had provided. Deer were plentiful along the lower Missouri, and the hunters, primarily Drouillard and the best shots among the enlisted men, kept the expedition reasonably well fed in those early weeks. There was an almost domestic quality to those early camps, before the wilderness became truly strange and the distances truly enormous. Men mended equipment, wrote in their journals, treated minor injuries and ailments, played cards, argued about nothing, looked at the stars, fell asleep. Lewis and Clark both kept detailed journals. Jefferson had been explicit about the importance of accurate record-keeping, and both men took that instruction seriously. Lewis's entries tended toward the scientific and the reflective, full of detailed descriptions and occasional passages of personal meditation. Clark's tended toward the practical and the navigational, distances covered, geographical observations, notes on the behavior of the river and the terrain. Together, the journals form one of the great documents of American exploration, not because they tell a dramatic, action-filled story in the conventional sense, but because they capture, with extraordinary patience and detail, what it actually felt like to move slowly through an unknown world. What it smelled like. What the light looked like at different hours. What the men ate and how tired they were, and what the river said when the wind was in a certain direction. Reading the journals, really reading them, slowly, the way they deserve to be read, is one of the quieter pleasures available to anyone interested in American history. They are a record of attention. Of paying close, careful, loving attention to a world that was, to those two men, entirely new. And somewhere ahead, just beyond the edge of what was yet visible from the keelboat's bow, the plains were waiting. A landscape so different from anything in Eastern American experience that the men who would first see it would struggle for language adequate to describe it. But they were not there yet. Not quite. Let the river carry us forward, slowly. The night is long, and we are in no hurry. Part 4, The First Great Silence, the Plains. There comes a moment, traveling westward up the Missouri River in the summer of 1804, when the forest ends. It does not end dramatically. It fades. The trees along the bank become smaller and more scattered, the willows and cottonwoods giving way to patches of grassland that grow wider and more continuous, until one morning you look out from the river and what you see in every direction is grass. Grass that runs to the horizon without a single interruption. Grass that moves in long, slow waves when the wind passes through it, making a sound like the sea, a deep, continuous whisper that has been going since before the first human being stood upright on this continent and looked westward into it and wondered what lay beyond. Lewis climbed the bluffs above the river one August morning in 1804 and stood at the edge of the plains, and what he wrote in his journal afterward was careful and a little odd. He described the landscape of extraordinary fertility, the grass thick and deep, the soil dark and rich, the air clear and scented with flowers he could not yet name. He described the absence of trees as an almost physical sensation, a sudden expansion of the visual field that left you feeling simultaneously exposed and free. He had never seen anything like it. Neither had any of the men. The Great Plains, that enormous, largely flat interior of North America that stretches from roughly the Missouri River westward to the Rocky Mountains, from southern Canada down into Texas, was, in 1804, among the least understood regions of the continent from a European-American perspective. A handful of French and Spanish traders had pushed along certain river corridors, and their reports had filtered back east in fragmentary form. But no systematic American survey had ever been conducted. The plains appeared on maps as a vague, unmarked territory, sometimes labeled simply as prairie or sometimes with no label at all. What Lewis and Clark found there was not emptiness. The plains were, in the summer of 1804, one of the most densely inhabited ecosystems in North America. The buffalo herds alone were beyond anything in Eastern American experience, vast, dark masses of animals that covered the hillsides and the valley floors, that could be heard before they were seen, the low, constant rumbling of their movement carrying across miles of still air. Clark estimated in his journal that a single herd he observed in late August of 1804 contained at least 300 buffalo in direct view, with the larger mass extending beyond visibility. Modern historians believe the total plains buffalo population at that time may have exceeded 30 million animals. There were elk moving through the river bottoms in groups of hundreds. There were deer everywhere, standing at the edge of the water in the early morning, watching the strange boat move upstream with a calm curiosity that suggested they had never learned to fear humans, or rather, that they had never encountered humans who hunted in the particular, relentless way that the expedition's hunters did. Pronghorn antelope moved across the hills in their peculiar, floating gait, faster than any animal Lewis had ever seen, covering ground with an ease that seemed almost contemptuous of distance. And there were creatures entirely new to science. Lewis encountered prairie dogs, small, sociable ground squirrels that lived in enormous underground colonies and barked at intruders from the entrances to their burrows. He was so fascinated that the expedition spent an entire afternoon pouring water down a burrow trying to flush one out, eventually capturing a live specimen that they sent back to Jefferson along with a collection of other animals and plant specimens on a boat that returned to St. Louis in the spring of 1805. The image of a prairie dog arriving at Monticello, blinking in the Virginia sunlight, is one of those small, odd, perfect historical moments that deserves more attention than it usually receives. There were also, of course, the people. The plains were home to numerous native nations in 1804, many of them relatively recent arrivals themselves, peoples who had moved onto the plains after the introduction of the horse in the 17th and 18th centuries, adapting their entire way of life to a new mobility and a new relationship with the buffalo. The Lakota Sioux, the Omaha, the Ponca, the Arikara, the Mandan, the Hidatsa. These nations had complex political structures, well-developed trade networks, and long histories of interaction with both each other and with the occasional European trader who ventured this far from the river settlements. The core of Discovery's first significant diplomatic encounter on the plains was with the Oto and Missouri peoples, at a place near present-day Fort Calhoun, Nebraska, in late July of 1804. Lewis and Clark called a council, setting up an awning on the bank of the river, dressing in their military uniforms, displaying the American flag, and preparing the gifts and medals that Jefferson had provided. Lewis gave a speech, the first version of a speech he would give many times over the following 2 years. It explained, with the combination of respect and condescension that characterized most official American Indian policy of the era, that the land now belonged to a great father in the East called Jefferson, that the native peoples were his children and would be well treated if they remained at peace, and that the expedition came in friendship and sought only to travel through peacefully, learn what it could, and establish the terms of a future relationship. The Oto and Missouri leaders listened carefully, accepted the gifts and medals, and responded with their own speeches, full of their own diplomatic formulations, their own assessments of the situation, their own polite expectations about what this encounter might mean for trade and for protection from their enemies. There was a fundamental misunderstanding at the heart of nearly every one of these encounters that both sides were too polite or too uncertain to name directly. The Americans believed they were establishing a new sovereign relationship, transferring allegiance from old European powers to the new American government. The native leaders understood the encounter as one in a long series of diplomatic engagements with powerful outsiders, an opportunity to negotiate, to establish mutual obligations, to expand their trade networks. They were talking about different things, in different frameworks, using the same words. The most dangerous diplomatic encounter of the entire journey up the lower Missouri came in late September of 1804, when the Corps reached the territory of the Teton Sioux, the Lakota, near present-day Pierre, South Dakota. The Lakota were the dominant military power of the northern plains. They controlled river traffic along this stretch of the Missouri, demanding tribute from traders who passed through their territory, a perfectly reasonable arrangement from their perspective, given that the river flowed through their land. The Americans, who had no intention of paying tribute to anyone, saw this as a blockade. The encounter that followed was the closest the expedition came, in those early months, to open violence. When the Corps attempted to leave after a tense first meeting, a group of Lakota warriors grabbed the tow rope of the keelboat. Lewis ordered the swivel gun on the bow loaded and aimed. Clark drew his sword. The men on the keelboat readied their rifles. For a long, still moment, the situation balanced on an edge. And then it didn't. The Lakota chief Black Buffalo walked forward and took the tow rope from the warriors, and the moment passed. There were several more days of negotiation, tense feasting, and careful politeness, before the Corps was finally allowed to continue upstream. Lewis and Clark both wrote about that encounter with a mixture of relief and the slightly defiant pride of people who felt they had stood their ground. They did not write about what it might have meant if the moment had gone the other way, if the gun had fired, or the sword had swung, and the small party of American soldiers had found themselves in open conflict with several hundred Lakota warriors in the middle of the northern plains, 3 months' travel from any American settlement. The plains were beautiful and strange, and full of creatures that science had never catalogued. And they were already spoken for, every inch of them. Let us carry that thought softly forward into the cooling night. Part 5, Fort Mandan, a Winter in the Cold. November 1804. The temperature had been dropping for weeks. The cottonwood trees along the Missouri had gone gold and then bare, their branches rattling in the wind from the north. The river itself was beginning to ice over, first at the edges, where the water was shallow and still, pale plates of ice forming in the early morning and sometimes melting by afternoon, then growing thicker, more permanent, until by mid-November the Missouri was running with ice floes large enough to damage or destroy a wooden boat. The Corps of Discovery had made it to the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples, situated near the Great Bend of the Missouri River in what is now central North Dakota. They had traveled approximately 1,600 miles from their starting point near the mouth of the Missouri, and they could travel no further that year. The season had closed around them. They chose a campsite on the east bank of the river, across from the Mandan villages, and began building. Fort Mandan, named for their neighbors, was a small triangular stockade, its walls of sharpened cottonwood logs about 18 feet high, its interior containing 2 rows of 4 huts each, arranged in a V-shape with a common area in the center. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was solid, and by the time they moved in during late November the temperature outside had dropped well below freezing and would continue dropping. The winter of 1804 to 1805 at Fort Mandan was extraordinary cold by even Northern Plains standards. By January, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit on some nights, so cold that the mercury in the thermometers froze solid and could not be read. The sentinels standing watch outside had to be rotated every hour to prevent frostbite. The horses that some of the men had acquired could barely move in the worst cold, their hoofs freezing to the ground, their breath making small dense clouds in the still air. Inside the huts, the men kept the fires burning as high as they could manage, burning through enormous quantities of wood that a chopping party had to work continuously to provide. The huts were small and smoky and smelled of men and damp wool and cooking, not pleasant exactly, but alive with the particular warmth of enclosed humanity in extreme cold, the kind of warmth that makes you feel the cold outside as a presence rather than an absence. The Mandan and Hidatsa villages across the river were old, established communities, earth-lodge towns that had existed in something like their current form for several centuries, positioned on a high bluff above the river where they commanded views of the surrounding plains and were protected against the flooding that periodically swept the lower ground. The earth lodges were remarkable structures, circular, built into the earth for insulation, with wooden frames covered by layers of packed earth that made them warm in winter and cool in summer. A large earth lodge could house several families and their horses. The horses were kept inside during the coldest weather, sharing their body heat with the humans. The relationship that developed between the Corps of Discovery and the Mandan and Hidatsa peoples over the winter of 1804 to 1805 was one of the most significant and genuinely reciprocal relationships of the entire expedition. Trade began almost immediately. The Americans had tools, particularly metal tools, knives and axes and awls, that the Mandan and Hidatsa valued highly. The native peoples had food, corn, dried squash, pumpkin, that the Corps desperately needed to supplement their supplies through the winter. They also had something the Corps needed even more urgently than food: knowledge. The Mandan and Hidatsa knew the upper Missouri River. Traders and war parties from these villages had traveled far up into the mountains, and the geographical knowledge that lived in the memories of the village elders and warriors was more accurate and more detailed than anything in Jefferson's collection of written reports. Lewis and Clark spent hours in the lodges of the chiefs, through interpreters, through signs, sometimes through chains of translation that passed through 3 or 4 languages, gathering information about what lay ahead. They learned about the tributaries of the upper Missouri, about the great falls that would require portage, about the mountains beyond, about which routes were passable and which were not. They also learned something unexpected and enormously useful, that there was, in the Hidatsa village nearby, a young woman who knew the territory beyond the mountains from her own experience. Her name was Sacagawea. She was approximately 16 or 17 years old in the winter of 1804 to 1805, though ages were not recorded with precision in the world she came from, and the estimates vary among historians. She was a member of the Agaidika band of the Lemhi Shoshone people, native to the mountains of what is now Idaho, the precise territory through which Lewis and Clark would need to pass. 5 or 6 years earlier, she had been captured in a Hidatsa raid on a Shoshone camp along the Beaverhead River, brought north to the Hidatsa villages, and had eventually become the wife, or rather, one of the wives, of a French-Canadian fur trader named Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was not a particularly admirable man by the evidence of the historical record. He was a middling interpreter, not especially brave or resourceful, prone to panic in dangerous situations, and the subject of critical observations in both Lewis's and Clark's journals. But he spoke Hidatsa and French, and his young wife spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa, and the chain of interpretation that ran through both of them would eventually allow the Corps to communicate with the Shoshone people who controlled the mountain passes, the people whose horses the expedition would desperately need to cross the Rockies. Lewis and Clark hired Charbonneau as an interpreter in November of 1804, and Sacagawea came with him, because she was his wife and because she was, in a way that neither Lewis nor Clark fully articulated but that the historical record makes evident, the more genuinely essential of the two. She was also, in February of 1805, very pregnant. On the 11th of February, 1805, while the Missouri was still frozen solid outside the walls of Fort Mandan, Sacagawea went into labor. It was a difficult labor, long and painful, the baby positioned in a way that made delivery dangerous. Lewis, who was functioning as the expedition's doctor, was called. He administered a dose of ground rattlesnake rattle dissolved in water, a remedy he had been told was useful for difficult deliveries, and whether it was the remedy or simply the passage of time, a healthy boy was born shortly afterward. They named him Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. Clark, who was genuinely fond of the baby, nicknamed him Pomp, a name that would follow the boy through a remarkable life of his own. The birth happened inside Fort Mandan, in the cold and the firelight, while the Missouri groaned and cracked outside under the weight of its ice. A new life, beginning at the edge of the unknown world. By April, the ice was breaking. The river was running clear. The days were longer, the light different, the air holding the first real warmth of the coming spring. It was time to move again. On the 7th of April, 1805, the Corps of Discovery sent the keelboat back downriver to St. Louis, loaded with specimens, reports, maps, and letters, and continued westward in a flotilla of smaller canoes and pirogues, pushing into a country that no American had ever seen. Ahead of them, the upper Missouri, the Great Falls, the Rocky Mountains, and everything beyond. Lewis wrote in his journal that evening with an excitement barely contained beneath his careful prose. He called the prospect of what lay ahead one of the most pleasurable emotions of his life. He was heading into the unknown. And he was glad. Part 6, The Country Nobody Had Named. There is a quality to the upper Missouri River that is different from everything downstream. Below the Mandan villages, the river runs through a broad, flat valley, its banks low and accessible, the horizon a long, easy line. Above them, the land begins to change. The valley narrows. The bluffs grow higher and more dramatic. The rock begins to show layer upon layer of ancient sediment carved into shapes by the river over millions of years, spires and columns and broad flat-topped formations that stand against the sky with the authority of things that have been standing for a very long time. Lewis described the white cliffs of the upper Missouri, a stretch of soft white sandstone formations that the river cuts through in the breaks country of present-day Montana, in some of the most beautiful passages in the entire expedition journal. He wrote about the forms the erosion had produced, castles and cathedrals, columns with elaborate capitals, ruins that looked as if they had been built by some ancient civilization and then slowly reclaimed by wind and water and time. He wrote that the scene brought to mind the ruins of some great city, and that he almost expected to hear the sounds of human habitation rising from those silent stone forms. There were no sounds except the river and the wind and the occasional cry of a raptor riding the thermals above the cliffs. The spring of 1805 was productive and sometimes dangerous. The men were in good condition. A winter of relative rest and adequate food had restored the strength that the long autumn push upstream had depleted. They were moving through country full of game, the elk and deer and beaver that made the river bottoms rich, the buffalo that gathered at the river crossings, the pronghorn on the hillsides above. But there were also grizzly bears. Lewis and Clark had heard about the grizzly bear from the Mandan and Hidatsa hunters, who spoke of it with a respect bordering on awe. They had been told that the grizzly was a different category of animal from the black bears of the eastern forests, larger, faster, more aggressive, far more difficult to kill. The Mandan hunters said that a man facing a grizzly alone needed real courage, and that even a war party of experienced hunters treated the animal with caution. Lewis, reading these reports through the somewhat skeptical lens of someone who had hunted black bear and found it manageable, wrote in his journal before encountering his first grizzly that he doubted the animal deserved quite so formidable a reputation. His attitude changed quickly. The first encounters with grizzlies in the spring of 1805 were genuinely alarming. Animals that absorbed 5 or 6 rifle balls without stopping, that pursued hunters at a run for hundreds of yards after being badly wounded, that had to be shot 8 or 10 times before they finally lay still. Lewis wrote after one such encounter that he was glad to have his men with him and would not choose to face the animal alone, a notable shift from his earlier skepticism. The grizzly bear became a kind of symbol of the western wilderness's refusal to be easily managed or categorized. It was, literally, beyond the scale of Eastern American experience. It required a different calibration of what was possible and what was dangerous. In mid-June of 1805, after weeks of travel through increasingly dramatic landscape, the Corps heard something before they saw it. A sound like distant thunder, continuous, not lessening as the day went on. A vibration that could be felt in the soles of the feet. A dampness in the air that was not rain. They were approaching the Great Falls of the Missouri. Lewis walked ahead on the 2nd of June to scout, and came over a rise to see for the first time the first of 5 cataracts that the Missouri drops over in the space of about 12 miles, waterfalls of extraordinary power and beauty, the largest dropping nearly 90 feet, the spray rising in a permanent white cloud visible from miles away. His journal entry that day is among the most rhapsodic pieces of writing in the entire record. He wrote that he wished for the pen of a skilled writer, the pencil of a painter, to do justice to what he was seeing. He wrote about the sound, the spray, the rainbows that formed in the mist when the afternoon sun hit at the right angle. He wrote about the beauty of it with an emotion that he usually kept carefully controlled in his journal, something that reads like genuine awe, unguarded and unashamed. And then, being Lewis, he took out his instruments and began making measurements. The portage around the Great Falls took approximately a month. A month of exhausting, ingenious, frequently miserable work. The Corps constructed rough wagons, axles made from the trunk of a cottonwood tree, wheels cut from cross-sections of the same tree, and used them to haul the canoes and supplies across the 18.5 miles of broken country between the bottom of the falls and the navigable river above. The terrain was not kind to them. The prickly pear cactus that covered the ground punctured the moccasins of every man on the expedition. Violent hailstorms swept the open country, stones large enough to draw blood when they hit exposed skin, and several of the men were badly bruised and one nearly knocked unconscious. Clark, out scouting with Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and baby Jean-Baptiste, was nearly caught in a flash flood that roared down a dry ravine without warning, filling it with 6 feet of churning water in seconds. They barely scrambled to safety, Sacagawea holding the baby above the water while Clark pulled them up the rock face. That moment, the young mother holding her infant son above the flood, the water rising around her knees, the sky above the ravine already clearing as if nothing had happened, is one of those images from the expedition journals that stays in the mind long after the facts have faded. She did not lose the baby. She did not lose the baby, and she did not lose the compass and medicine bundle and trade items that she was also somehow managing to carry. By mid-July, the portage was complete. The canoes were back in the water above the falls. The mountains were visible ahead, the first real mountains, the first hint of the enormous stone wall that separated the Missouri River drainage from the Pacific slope. And somewhere in those mountains were the Shoshone Sacagawea's people, without whose horses the expedition would not be able to cross. The urgency of that need was becoming very clear. Part 7, The Mountains, and a Woman Coming Home. There is something strange and moving about the moment when a person who has been taken from their home is returned to it. Not in the way they left, that is never possible. But in the sense of standing again in the landscape that formed them, recognizing the shapes of hills and the color of a river and the quality of air at a particular altitude, and feeling in the body before the mind has processed it, I have been here before. As the Corps of Discovery pushed up the Jefferson River, one of the three tributaries whose confluence forms the Missouri, into the mountains of what is now southwestern Montana in July and August of 1805, Sacagawea began to recognize things. She recognized a rock formation that her people called the Beaver's Head. She told Lewis and Clark that this was the territory of her nation, and that the main camp of the Shoshone would be found on the other side of the mountains ahead. This information was critical, because the Corps was running low on food, the horses they carried were exhausted, and the mountain passes would need to be found before the autumn snows closed them. Lewis, who was frequently ahead of the main party on foot, crossed the Continental Divided Lemhi Pass on August 12, 1805, and stood for the first time on the Pacific side of the Rocky Mountains. He had expected, or rather, Jefferson had expected, and Lewis had hoped, to see at the bottom of the western slope a gentle, navigable river flowing toward the sea. This had been the theory of the Northwest Passage, that the headwaters of the Missouri and the headwaters of a Pacific-flowing river would be close together, perhaps separated by a single, short mountain crossing. What Lewis saw instead was more mountains. Range after range, running to the horizon in every direction, their peaks still carrying snow in mid-August, their valleys dark with forest. Not a short portage to a convenient river. An enormous, complex, brutal mountain system that would take weeks to cross, if they could cross it at all. He wrote about this discovery with characteristic discipline, describing what he saw accurately, recording his measurements, noting the geographical reality carefully. What he did not write about, but what must have been present in that moment, was the collapse of the fundamental geographical assumption on which the expedition had been based. There was no short portage. There was no easy water route to the Pacific. He allowed himself a brief rest at the top of the pass, drinking from a spring whose water flowed toward the Pacific, and then descended the western slope to find the Shoshone. The first contact was tentative and nearly collapsed several times due to misunderstandings and the natural wariness of a people who had good reason to be cautious about strangers. Lewis spent several tense days with a band of Shoshone hunters and their chief, a man named Kamiwait, before the main party with Sacagawea arrived and the encounter shifted in a way that no amount of diplomatic planning could have produced. During the formal council, the awning set up, the gifts arranged, the interpreters ready, Sacagawea was called to translate. She sat down, looked at the Shoshone chief who was to speak, and stopped. She stood up. She moved toward him. She put a blanket around his shoulders, and she wept. The chief was her brother. His name was Kamiwait. He had been a boy of perhaps 10 or 11 when she was taken. He was now a young man, the leader of his band, and he was sitting at a diplomatic council in his own territory, and his lost sister was walking toward him out of the group of strange Americans who had materialized from the east. The reunion was brief, the council still needed to proceed, horses still needed to be negotiated, the expedition still needed to keep moving before the passes closed. Sacagawea composed herself and returned to her work as interpreter, though according to Lewis and Clark's journals she was unable to keep entirely from crying throughout the remainder of the session. The journals do not record what Kamiwate felt, or what passed between the siblings when the council was over and there was a moment of private space. They record what was negotiable and what was practical. The inner life of that reunion exists only in the space the journals leave around it. But imagine it, if you will. Imagine the years between the loss, the adaptation, the life built in captivity, the baby carried across a continent. And then this, a familiar face in a world entirely made of strangers. The Shoshone provided horses. More than 20 horses for carrying the supplies, and several more for riding, including one for Sacagawea, because even among all the complex negotiations and practical considerations, someone thought to make sure she did not have to walk. The Corps of Discovery loaded the horses and began to climb. What followed was the most physically brutal passage of the entire expedition. The Bitterroot Mountains, the range that lay between the Shoshone Territory and the navigable rivers of the Pacific Slope, were steep, cold, and covered with fallen timber that made the trail nearly impassable. A Shoshone guide named Old Toby led them, and without him they would almost certainly have gotten lost and died. Lewis wrote that he had never seen his men in such wretched condition. After 11 days in the mountains, they descended the western slope into the territory of the Nez Perce people, who greeted them with food, camas root and dried salmon that most of the Corps ate too quickly after the days of near starvation, making many of the men severely ill. But they were through the mountains. The Clearwater River lay ahead, and below it the Snake, and below the Snake the Columbia, and the Columbia flowed to the sea. The hardest part was behind them. Or so they believed, in that particular way that exhausted people allow themselves to believe when they have just survived something nearly impossible. Part 8. The Columbia River to the Sea. The rivers of the Pacific Northwest run differently from the Missouri. The Missouri is a plains river, wide and shallow and sediment-laden, its color the particular pale brown of the earth it carries, its current strong but horizontal, pushing back against you with a steady, muscular pressure. The rivers of the Pacific Slope are mountain rivers, at least in their upper reaches, clear and cold and fast, dropping through narrow canyons with the urgency of water that has somewhere important to be. The Corps built new canoes from the ponderosa pines along the Clearwater River in late September of 1805 and pushed off into the current with a sensation, for the first time in more than a year of upstream travel, of the river helping them rather than opposing them. For the first time, they were going downstream. Going downstream is a different kind of travel. The body relaxes in a different way. The landscape moves past with a different speed. You can look around more freely, attend to the details of the riverbanks and the sky and the water around you, because the work of moving forward is being done by the current itself rather than by your own muscles. They ran the rapids of the Clearwater and then the Snake with a combination of skill and recklessness that modern whitewater experts have described as extraordinary for men who had never seen rivers like these. Several canoes swamped. Supplies were lost. There were close calls that the journals record with a casualness that probably reflects fatigue more than indifference. The landscape through which the snake runs in present-day Idaho and Washington is one of the most dramatic in North America, a deep basalt canyon carved by the river over millions of years, the walls rising hundreds of feet above the water, the dark rock layered in columnar, the light coming down from above in long, angled shafts. In the autumn, the cottonwoods along the river margins had turned gold, and their reflection in the clear water made the river look as if it were carrying light downstream with it. At the confluence of the Snake and the Columbia, in mid-October of 1805, they entered the domain of the salmon. The Columbia River system was, before the era of dams, one of the greatest salmon rivers in the world. The fall run of Chinook and coho salmon that moved up the river system in October was so enormous as to be almost incomprehensible to people from the eastern United States, where salmon runs were modest by comparison. Lewis estimated at one point that the river was running solid with fish for a distance of hundreds of yards, a claim that seems hyperbolic but is supported by other accounts of the Columbia's pre-dam salmon runs. The native peoples of the Columbia River, the Yakima, the Umatilla, the Wishram, and many others, had built their entire civilization around the salmon. The fish was not merely a food source but the center of a complex religious, economic, and social order that had been functioning for thousands of years. Fishing platforms extended over the rapids. Weirs and nets and spears had been refined over generations to extraordinary efficiency. Salmon were dried and smoked and stored in quantities sufficient to feed entire communities through the winter. The Corps moved through this world as observers and beneficiaries, buying dried salmon and camas root from the river peoples, camping at the edges of villages that had been established at fishing sites for centuries, trying to communicate through a chain of interpretation that was becoming increasingly strained as they moved further from languages that Sacagawea could help translate. The lower Columbia presented different navigational challenges from the upper river. Below the Cascades, the dramatic series of rapids and falls where the river cuts through the Cascade Range, the river widened and slowed, entering the tidal estuary that extends for 100 miles above the river's mouth. Here the water was brackish, tidal, responding to the rhythms of the distant ocean. Here the fog came in from the coast, gray and soft and smelling of salt, and the men who had spent their entire lives in the interior of the continent encountered for the first time the smell of the sea. On November 7, 1805, 6 months and more than 3,000 miles from Fort Mandan, Clark wrote in his journal, with a simplicity that makes the words almost glow, "Ocean in view." Oh! The joy! He misspelled ocean, as he spelled almost everything according to the sound of the word as he heard it in his own accent, and the misspelling is somehow perfect, urgent, alive, breathless with the emotion of a man who has just seen, for the first time, the thing he has been traveling toward for a year and a half. It was not, strictly speaking, the ocean. They were still in the estuary, the surf still miles away. But the waters were wide and gray and rolling, and the horizon had the particular quality of a horizon that has no land behind it, and after everything they had crossed to get here, it was close enough. They were not, precisely, the first Americans to reach the Pacific coast. American trading ships had been visiting the coast for decades. But they were the first to come overland, from the interior, through the mountains and the rivers, from the world of the Missouri and the plains and the eastern forests. They had crossed the continent. Now they needed to figure out how to survive the winter. Part 9, Fort Clatsop, Rain and Long Waiting. The Oregon coast in the winter is not a hospitable place. Rain. Almost constant, relentless, penetrating rain, not the dramatic thunderstorms of the interior but the gray, quiet, continuous rain of the Pacific maritime climate, which falls steadily for weeks at a time and seeps into everything. Into clothing, into bedding, into food supplies, into the wood of the canoes, into the walls of any shelter not built with the particular expertise that the coast's native peoples had developed over thousands of years in exactly this climate. The Corps voted on where to spend the winter, another of those democratic moments that the journals record with a certain understated significance. All members of the permanent party voted, including York and Sacagawea, and the majority chose the south bank of the Columbia, where game appeared to be somewhat more plentiful and the exposure to the worst coastal storms somewhat less severe. They built Fort Clatsop, named for the Clatsop people who inhabited the immediate area, in December of 1805, working in the rain, cutting timber in the rain, notching logs and raising walls in the rain. By Christmas Day they had a roofed structure, though it leaked, and they were able to move out of their sodden tents and into something that at least approximated shelter. Christmas at Fort Clatsop was a subdued affair. The men had no gifts, whatever supplies they might have reserved for celebration had been depleted long since. They had some tobacco, which Clark distributed. They had what Lewis described as poor elk, so much spoiled that we eat it through mere necessity. They had each other's company, and they had the extraordinary knowledge of what they had accomplished, and they had a wet, gray, foggy Oregon winter pressing in from all sides. The winter at Fort Clatsop lasted until March of 1806, more than 3 months. It was not as dangerous as the winter at Fort Mandan, where the cold itself had been life-threatening. The danger here was different, a slow accumulation of discomfort, illness, and tedium that eroded morale in ways that the dramatic challenges of the journey had not. The rain fell approximately every day of those 3 months. Lewis estimated afterward that there were perhaps 12 days during the entire winter that could be described as clear. The men's buckskin clothing rotted in the constant damp. Their food was the elk that the hunters brought in good when it was fresh, which it rarely stayed for long in the wet warmth of the coastal winter, rapidly becoming putrid. The fleas that infested the coastal native villages were extraordinary in their numbers and persistence, following the Corps back to Fort Clatsop and the hides they traded for, making sleep difficult and miserable. Lewis, who was prone to what the journals describe as periods of low spirits even in the best circumstances, found the winter difficult in ways he did not always articulate directly. He spent much of his time at Fort Clatsop writing enormous, detailed journal entries describing every plant and animal and coastal people he had encountered, filling in the scientific record that Jefferson had requested with the patient thoroughness of a man who needed the work to stay sane. His descriptions of the coastal peoples, the Clatsop, the Chinook, the Tillamook, are detailed and generally respectful, though shaped by the assumptions of his era and his position. He describes their technology, the remarkable seagoing canoes, the woven hats that shed rain perfectly, the complex trade systems that linked coastal peoples from Alaska to California, with genuine scientific curiosity. He describes their social structures and their religious practices with more caution, aware of how much he was not understanding. There was one object that Lewis and Clark both wanted desperately that winter and that eluded them entirely. A blue whale. Reports had reached Fort Clatsop in January that a whale had stranded itself on the beach south of the Columbia's mouth, an enormous animal of a species none of them had seen before. Lewis and Clark organized a party to go see it, collecting scientific data and hopefully a quantity of whale oil and blubber that would have been a valuable supplement to their supplies. Sacagawea asked to go. She had come all this way, she said, through Charbonneau, to see the great water and the great fish. She had not yet seen either. She was pointed out, with some emotional force, the injustice of having come so far and being excluded from this excursion. Clark agreed to take her. By the time they reached the beach, the whale had been almost entirely stripped by the Tillamook people, who had arrived first and processed the animal with the efficiency of a community that had been hunting and rendering whales for centuries. Only the skeleton remained, gleaming on the gray sand under the gray sky. Clark managed to purchase a small quantity of whale oil and blubber from the Tillamook, and Sacagawea stood on the beach and looked at the ocean for the first time, the waves coming in heavy and gray from the endless Pacific, the sky merging with the water at the horizon in a way that made it impossible to say where one ended and the other began. What she thought, standing there, we do not know. The journals do not give her interior life. They give us the facts of her presence, and the facts are extraordinary enough on their own, but the inner experience, what it felt like to be her, in that moment, on that beach, having traveled farther from her homeland than any person of her nation had ever traveled, and then arrived at the edge of a sea that had no name in her language, that is a silence the journals cannot fill. By late February, the supplies were running dangerously low. The elk hunting had become difficult as the animals moved away from the coastal forests in search of better forage. The men were thin, their clothing worn through, their equipment in poor repair after months of constant damp. On the 23rd of March, 1806, the Corps of Discovery broke camp at Fort Clatsop, pushed their canoes into the Columbia, and turned east. The journey home had begun. Part 10, The Long Way Home. Going home is never the same as going out. The land is theoretically familiar, you have been through it before, you have notes and maps and the memory of what lies around the next bend. But the familiar and the known are different things. You are a different person than the one who first passed through this country. The country itself has changed in small ways, the seasons are different, the rivers are running at different levels, the camps you made on the way out are just marks in the earth now, already beginning to be reclaimed. The return journey of the Corps of Discovery was, in some ways, more difficult than the outward journey, and in other ways easier. It was. Part 10, continued The Long Way Home. Going home is never the same as going out. The land is theoretically familiar, you have been through it before, you have notes and maps and the memory of what lies around the next bend. But the familiar and the known are different things. You are a different person than the one who first passed through this country. The country itself has changed in small ways, the seasons are different, the rivers are running at different levels, the camps you made on the way out are just marks in the earth now, already beginning to be reclaimed. The return journey of the Corps of Discovery was, in some ways, more difficult than the outward journey, and in other ways easier. It was easier because the current was behind them on the Columbia, and they knew the route, and they had the deep internal resource of people who have already done something hard once and know they can do it again. It was harder because the Bitterroot Mountains, those brutal, timber-choked passes that had nearly destroyed them in September, would need to be crossed again, this time in the wrong direction, back through the snow. They pushed up the Columbia against the spring current, trading and navigating and re-establishing relationships with the river peoples they had passed through the previous autumn. The fishing season was just beginning as they moved upstream, and the villages along the river were alive with activity, the platforms over the rapids crowded with fishermen, the smoke of the curing fires rising in long gray columns above the canyon walls, the smell of salmon and wood smoke everywhere. A smell that had been filling that valley every spring for thousands of years before these particular travelers arrived and would continue for generations after they left. There were tensions on the return that had not been present on the way out, or that had been present but were now more pronounced. Thefts of tools and equipment from the Corps camps had become more frequent as they moved through the lower river country, and Lewis, whose temper was shorter on the return journey than it had been on the way out, responded to these incidents with a directness that occasionally escalated situations dangerously. Where Clark tended to manage conflicts with patience and diplomacy, Lewis sometimes moved too quickly toward confrontation, and the journals from the return journey show a man whose reserves of equanimity had been significantly depleted by the long winter and the weight of what still lay ahead. The Nez Perce, who had cared for the Corps' horses through the winter and welcomed the expedition back in April of 1806, proved to be generous hosts again, but there was nothing to be done about the Bitterroot Mountains. The snow was still deep in the high passes. A first attempt to cross in May was turned back after a few days by snow depths of 15 and 20 feet on the trail, depths so extreme that the trail itself was invisible and navigation without it was impossible. They retreated to the Nez Perce villages and waited, with the particular impatience of people who are not accustomed to being stopped by weather, for the mountains to become passable. It was not until late June of 1806 that the Corps was able to cross the Bitterroots successfully, guided by Nez Perce hunters who knew the passes in a way no amount of Lewis's celestial navigation could replicate. Even then, snow covered the trail in places, and the horses moved carefully on the icy slopes. But they were through in 6 days, half the time the crossing had taken the previous autumn, and descended into the Montana valleys with an almost physical sense of the mountains releasing their grip. Here, on the return journey, Lewis and Clark made a decision that was strategically interesting and, in one instance, nearly fatal. They decided to split the Corps into 2 parties for part of the return journey, in order to explore additional river drainages that they had not been able to examine on the way out. Clark would take the majority of the men south through the Yellowstone River Valley, examining that great drainage all the way to its confluence with the Missouri. Lewis would take a smaller party north to explore the Marias River, a northern tributary of the Missouri that he had bypassed on the way west, and then the 2 groups would reunite at the confluence of the Marias and the Missouri. Clark's journey down the Yellowstone was remarkable for its beauty and its game. He described herds of buffalo so numerous that they blocked the river itself at the crossing places, thousands of animals swimming the river in loose, continuous masses, the water churned white around them. He described the cottonwood forests along the river bottom in full summer leaf, the air hot and scented with sage and the sweet, dusty smell of dry prairie grass. He described the great stone formations near the river that he named for Sacagawea's son of Pompey's Pillar, a sandstone butte rising 200 feet above the river plain, on the smooth face of which Clark carved his name and the date. William Clark. July 25, 1806. It is still there. The only physical signature of the Lewis and Clark expedition that remains visible in the landscape today, carved into the rock on a summer afternoon by a red-haired man who understood, perhaps, that some record more permanent than paper ought to mark the fact of his passing. Lewis's journey north to the Marias was shorter and ended in the most violent incident of the entire expedition. Near the headwaters of the Marias River, in the high plains of present-day northern Montana, Lewis's small party of 4 men encountered a group of 8 young Blackfoot warriors. The meeting was tense from the beginning. The Blackfoot were not a people the Corps had successfully established relations with, and they knew, or suspected, that the Americans were planning to arm the Blackfoot's traditional enemies, which in fact Jefferson's policy did contemplate. Lewis spent an uneasy night camped with the Blackfoot party, and in the early morning hours a confrontation erupted when the warriors attempted to take the expedition's rifles and horses. In the struggle that followed, 2 of the Blackfoot men were killed, 1 stabbed by one of Lewis's men, 1 shot by Lewis himself. It was the only killing of the entire 2.5-year journey, and it happened in a matter of seconds, in the half-light of a Montana dawn, at the very end of the outward arc of the expedition's reach. Lewis and his men rode hard for the Missouri afterward, covering nearly 100 miles in a single day, expecting pursuit from a larger Blackfoot war party. The pursuit, if it came at all, never caught them, and they reached the Missouri exhausted and shaken. And then, a few days later, there was one more accident to close the episode of separation. On the 12th of August, 1806, Lewis and his men were hunting in the willow thickets along the Missouri when Pierre Cruzet, the one-eyed fiddle player, mistook Lewis for an elk and shot him through the buttock. The wound was painful and debilitating but not life-threatening, and Lewis spent the remainder of the journey lying on his stomach in the bottom of a canoe, dictating journal entries and attempting to maintain the authority of command while unable to sit up or walk without assistance. It was, in a way, a fittingly human ending to an extraordinary journey. Not a dramatic final triumph, but a man flat on his back in a canoe, shot by his own musician, drifting down the Missouri toward home. Clark took over all medical and command duties for the final days of the journey, and on the 17th of August, near the Mandan villages, the two parties reunited. They paused there to say goodbye to Sacagawea and Charbonneau and baby Jean-Baptiste, Clark offering, in a letter, to take the boy east and educate him when he was old enough, an offer that Charbonneau eventually accepted years later. And then they pushed downstream, with the full force of the Missouri's current behind them, toward St. Louis. On the 23rd of September, 1806, the Corps of Discovery arrived at the outskirts of St. Louis. They had been gone 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. They had traveled approximately 8,000 miles. Every member of the permanent party, every single one, had survived, with the single exception of Sergeant Floyd, who had died in the first summer from causes that had nothing to do with the wilderness. People along the riverbank stared. Some of them had assumed the Corps was dead. Reports had been fragmentary, uncertain, and eventually absent, and the assumption that so small a party could have survived what it had undertaken had faded from probability to hope to memory in the 2 years since the keelboat had gone out of sight upstream. But here they were, coming back down the river, alive. Part 11, What They Brought Back. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of an extraordinary thing. Not emptiness. Not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of everything having happened, and the world needing a moment to absorb it. When Lewis and Clark arrived in St. Louis in late September of 1806, the celebrations were immediate and enthusiastic. Dinners were held. Toasts were drunk. Letters flew east to Jefferson, to family members, to the newspapers that had long since given up reporting on an expedition they assumed had perished in the wilderness. Jefferson received the news at Monticello with deep satisfaction. The expedition had succeeded, not in the geographical sense, since there was no short water route to the Pacific, but in every other respect that mattered to him. The information it had returned with was staggering in its breadth and depth, a scientific and geographical windfall that would take decades to fully process and publish. Consider what they had brought back. From the scientific record alone, Lewis had formally described and documented at least 178 plants previously unknown to Euro-American science, and approximately 122 species and subspecies of animals. The list reads like a catalog of the American West: the grizzly bear, formally described; the pronghorn antelope; the prairie dog; the mountain goat; the black-tailed prairie dog, the western meadowlark, the Steller's jay, the greater sage grouse; the cutthroat trout. Species of cottonwood and sagebrush and bitterroot that would carry into the scientific literature the names Lewis gave them, or that would be named in his honor. There were pressed plant specimens, carefully labeled and preserved, that arrived in Washington still identifiable after the long journey. There were mineral samples. There were the hides and skins of animals that naturalists in Philadelphia and London could study. There were vocabularies, carefully compiled word lists from the 40-odd native languages the expedition had encountered, representing some of the earliest systematic documentation of those languages by European-trained observers. There were maps. Clark's maps of the western interior, drawn from his meticulous surveying throughout the journey, corrected and refined during the long winter at Fort Clatsop and the return journey, were the most accurate representation of the North American West that existed anywhere in the world for several decades after the expedition's return. They were working documents, in places still rough or uncertain, but they gave the American government and the American public a coherent geographical picture of a territory that had previously existed only in rumor. And there were the journals themselves, not yet published, not yet fully edited, but existing as a record of daily life in the American wilderness over more than 2 years, full of observations and descriptions and human moments that constituted, collectively, one of the great documents of exploration in any language. Jefferson had asked for all of this, and Lewis and Clark had delivered all of it, and more. But what they could not entirely deliver, what the expedition could not account for or contain, was the human complexity of what they had passed through. The native nations of the West had been visited, documented, described, and informed that a new government now claimed sovereignty over their lands. The diplomatic protocols that Lewis and Clark had followed carefully, the councils, the speeches, the medals, the flags, had established, in American eyes, a legal and political framework for that claim. In the eyes of the native nations, those same encounters had established something quite different: trade relationships, diplomatic contacts, the beginning of a relationship with a new kind of foreign power that might be useful or might be dangerous depending on how it developed. Neither interpretation was wrong, exactly. They were just describing different things in the same words, as they always had been. What followed the Lewis and Clark expedition, the decades of westward American expansion, the fur trade that stripped the beaver from the mountain streams within a generation, the settlers that followed the routes Lewis and Clark had mapped, the military campaigns that pushed the native peoples from their lands, the eventual extinction of the great buffalo herds, the confinement of those same peoples to reservations on fractions of their original territory, none of that was Lewis and Clark's intention, and much of it would have horrified them. But they had opened the door. They had mapped the path. They had brought back the information that made everything that followed possible. History does not always distinguish between intention and effect. The door stands open regardless of why it was pushed. Lewis himself received a hero's reception in Washington and then in Virginia, was appointed governor of Louisiana Territory, and then, slowly, painfully, in a way that his journals and his letters partially illuminate and partially obscure, began to fall apart. He had always struggled with what his contemporaries called hypochondria and what we might now recognize as depression, periods of deep withdrawal and inaction alternating with the intense, focused energy that had made him so effective in the field. In the years after the expedition, those periods of darkness became longer and more severe. The pressures of the governorship were considerable and sometimes overwhelming. There were financial difficulties, debts accumulated during the expedition's supply gathering that the government was slow to reimburse. There was the enormous, still unfinished project of the expedition's official publication, which Lewis had been working on but which kept stalling, which Jefferson kept asking about, which hung over him like an obligation he could not quite meet. In October of 1809, Meriwether Lewis died at a small and called Grinder's stand on the Natchez Trace in Tennessee, while traveling to Washington to resolve some of the financial and administrative disputes surrounding the Louisiana Territory governorship. He was 35 years old. Whether he died by his own hand or was murdered remains a historical question that has never been definitively settled. The evidence assembled by most historians points towards suicide, and Jefferson himself believed that Lewis had taken his own life. But the physical evidence was ambiguous, witnesses gave contradictory accounts, and the debate has continued, with varying degrees of intensity, for more than 2 centuries. What is not ambiguous is the loss. He had crossed a continent and come back. He had described the world he found there with more care and more intelligence than almost anyone could have managed. He had led 32 men through the wilderness and brought them all home. And then, in a small room in Tennessee on a cool October night, something in him that the wilderness had not been able to break finally broke. The official narrative of the expedition, the published account that Jefferson had always wanted, the story of the journey as Lewis himself would have told it, was never completed by its author. It was eventually compiled and published in 1814 by the journalist Nicholas Biddle, working from the journals that Clark and others provided, producing a narrative that is valuable and readable but is missing something that only Lewis could have supplied. Clark lived until 1838, long enough to see many of the consequences of the world he and Lewis had helped open. He served as superintendent of Indian Affairs for much of that period, the government official responsible for managing the relationship between the United States and the Western Native nations, including many of the same peoples the Corps of Discovery had visited. The record of his work in that role is, like the man himself, complicated. There are moments of genuine advocacy for Native interests, and there are moments of accommodation with policies that caused great harm. He kept Lewis's portrait in his home throughout his life. He named one of his sons Meriwether Lewis Clark. Some things outlast the words we have for them. Part 12, What the Stars Remembered. The stars above the Missouri River on a clear night in late summer are extraordinary. Far from any city, far from any electric light, on a hillside above the river valley where the cottonwoods make a dark border between the water and the sky, the stars are not the faint, scattered points that city dwellers know. They are thick and layered, the Milky Way a true band of light across the dome of the sky, the planets bright enough to cast faint shadows, the whole turning slowly on its axis through the long hours of the night. Lewis measured those stars. Night after night, in camp after camp, he took out his sextant and his chronometer and made the careful observations that would allow him to calculate longitude, to place each point on the map with the precision that the journey's scientific mission required. He was not always successful. The measurements were difficult, the instruments less reliable than modern equivalents, and the longitude calculations that Lewis made in the field contain errors that later analysis has identified and corrected. But the attempt was made, night after night, in the cold and the dark, with the firelight behind him and the instruments cold in his hands and the stars doing what stars do regardless of who is watching. There is something deeply human about that image. The man standing in the dark with his instrument, trying to fix his position in the universe. Trying to know, with precision, exactly where he stands. We all do that, in one way or another. The Corps of Discovery slept under those stars for more than 2 years. Slept on sandbanks and in canvas tents, on beds of grass and on the bare ground, in the winter lodges of the Mandan and in the leaking huts of Fort Clatsop, in the mountains and on the plains and in the river valleys of the Pacific Northwest. They slept badly sometimes, in the cold and the wet and the misery of fleas and hunger. And they slept beautifully sometimes, in the deep, bone-tired sleep of people who have worked hard all day in clean air and have a dry bed and a full stomach and nothing pressing at the mind except the knowledge that tomorrow will bring more of the same extraordinary world. Think of what it must have been like to wake in the pre-dawn dark in the middle of the American plains, 200 years ago, with no light on the horizon but the stars. The horses shifting nearby. The fire burned to coals, glowing dull red in the dark. The Missouri making its sound somewhere below the camp, the low, continuous murmur of moving water that is one of the most soothing sounds the world produces. And the quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a natural quiet so deep and so old that it feels almost material, something you could reach out and touch, something that has weight and texture. Lewis, who was often awake before the others, would sometimes walk away from the camp in those pre-dawn hours and stand alone in the dark, taking his observations, or simply standing. The journals give us occasional glimpses of these moments, a brief sentence, a notation of the temperature or the condition of the sky, and then something more personal creeping in at the edges. A sentence that begins as a scientific observation and ends as something closer to meditation. He was a man who needed solitude, and the wilderness provided it in a form that was both terrifying and sustaining. The vast, impersonal silence of the plains did not care about his ambitions or his debts or his failures or his success. It simply was. It had been there long before him and it would be there long after, and in the face of that fact, the particular weight of being Meriwether Lewis, with all the expectations and the responsibilities and the private darkness, was temporarily easier to carry. Clark, for his part, left a different kind of trace in the record. He was a man more comfortably at home in the world, more at ease with other people, more capable of the daily social negotiations that communal life requires. His journal entries rarely reach for the philosophical. But they are full of a quality of attention that is its own form of depth, the careful noting of distances and directions, the precise recording of what was eaten and what was traded and how far they traveled and what the weather was like, building over 2 years into a picture of the world that is exact and rich and irreplaceable. He was paying attention. He was making sure it was written down. He understood, in the practical way of someone whose primary gift is for accuracy rather than eloquence, that the record mattered. He was right. The record does matter. It has mattered for more than 200 years, and it will continue to matter for reasons that its makers could not fully anticipate, not just as a historical document, not just as a scientific catalog, but as a human story. A story about what it is to go into the unknown, to do the work, to be afraid and keep moving, to find in other people, in the people who share your fire and your danger and your purpose, something that makes the difficulty worth the bearing. And a story about the other people. The ones who were already there. The Mandan and the Hidatsa, whose villages have been flooded now by the reservoirs behind the dams on the upper Missouri, their traditional sites beneath hundreds of feet of still water. The Shoshone, whose territory in the Lemhi Valley was eventually taken from them, who were removed from the mountains that had been theirs for generations and settled on a reservation in southern Idaho. The Nez Perce, who would fight their famous war against the United States Army in 1877, retreating across the mountains in an epic journey that echoed, in its direction, its geography, its desperate endurance, something of the core of Discovery's own passage, before they were finally stopped just short of the Canadian border and their leader, Chief Joseph, delivered one of the most eloquent speeches of surrender in the American record. The Blackfoot, who remember the 2 killings on the Marias River and do not tell the story of Lewis and Clark the way it is told in Washington, D.C. The Clatsop and the Chinook, whose descendants still live near the mouth of the Columbia and who maintain their own memory of the strange winter visitors who built a leaking fort on the south bank and ate too much of their elk. These are all part of the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They are not footnotes or complications or addenda. They are the story itself, told from a different center, with different heroes and different villains and a different understanding of what the whole thing meant. What the core of Discovery crossed was not empty. What they mapped was not unmade. What they found was not lost. It was known. It was lived in and loved and named in languages that the journals mostly did not record. It was someone's home before it was anyone's discovery. And still, and this is the human complication that history forces us to sit with, it was also extraordinary. The journey was genuinely extraordinary. The endurance and the intelligence and the care and the attention that Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery brought to their passage through that world was genuinely remarkable. The scientific record they produced was genuinely valuable. The human stories embedded in the journals, the birth of Jean-Baptiste in the cold at Fort Mandan, the reunion of Sacagawea and her brother on the other side of the mountains, the sound of Cruzette's fiddle rising into the prairie dark, those stories are real, and they are worth remembering. We can hold all of that at once, if we are patient enough. The wonder and the wrong. The achievement and the cost. The heroes in the journals and the people whose stories the journals did not know how to tell. That is what history asks of us, in its quieter moments. Not judgment, not celebration, not condemnation. Attention. The same quality of attention that Lewis gave to the petals of a new flower on a summer morning in Montana, that Clark gave to the measurements of the river at each new camp, that Sacagawea gave to the shapes of the hills as they moved through the mountains toward her brother. Close attention to the real texture of the world, and the people in it. That is enough. That is, perhaps, everything. The stars above the Missouri are very old. They were there before any of these people, before the animals they hunted and described, before the rivers that carved the landscape through which they traveled. They will be there long after every record of this journey has dissolved and the names have been forgotten. But tonight, lying still and comfortable and warm, you can feel the faint echo of those campfires and those river sounds and those long, quiet evenings at the edge of the unknown world. You can let the story settle into you the way a good fire settles into embers, not extinguished, just quieter, giving off a steady warmth that needs no more fuel. The journey is complete. The continent has been crossed. The men have come home, and the woman has seen the ocean, and the baby born in winter has grown into a life. And somewhere above the Missouri River, on a clear night in late summer, the stars keep their watch over a country that is still, in all the ways that matter, full of things we have not yet learned to see. Closing meditation. Let your breath slow now, very gently. Let the rivers and the mountains and the plains of the story begin to soften at their edges, the way landscape softens in the last light of evening, the details still there, but less insistent, settling into the larger shape of the whole. You have traveled a long way tonight. Through the tallgrass country of the lower Missouri, through the dramatic stone formations of the upper river, over the continental divide in the footsteps of people who had no map of what waited on the other side. You have sat by fires on the northern plains while a fiddle played somewhere in the dark, and you have stood at the edge of the Pacific and watched the gray waves come in from the endless water. Let all of that settle now into the body. Into the weight of your limbs on the surface beneath you. Into the rise and fall of your chest. The breath in. The breath out. Think for a moment, if you like, about the particular quality of stillness that the wilderness gives, that enormous, impersonal quiet that has nothing to do with you and asks nothing of you and simply continues, whether you are there to notice it or not. Let that quality of stillness be here now, in this room, around your sleeping body. The noise of the day has already moved a long way off. The concerns and the urgencies and the unfinished thoughts are still there, somewhere, but they are quieter now. They can wait. They are not going anywhere. You are safe here. You are warm. You are held by the familiar weight of where you are. That sound, the sound of a river in the dark, is one of the oldest sounds a human being can hear. It was there before language, before memory, before any of the names we have given to things. It is the sound the world makes when it is simply being itself, without any performance or pretense, in the deep hours of the night. Let that sound be underneath your breathing now. Soft, continuous, moving in the same direction, always, towards something wide and open and still. Your eyes are closed. Your hands are relaxed. Your shoulders have let go of whatever they were carrying. The fire has burned low. The stars are at their highest. The men in the camp are sleeping, their breathing slow and regular, the sound of the river below carrying them gently down into the deep water of sleep. And you are sleeping too, now. Or nearly. Somewhere just at the edge of the story in the dark, where the two things meet and become the same thing, where the images dissolve into a warmth that has no shape and no direction and no urgency at all. Only rest. Only the river. Only the stars. Good night. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.